So I'll try to run through this as fast as I can. I love that all those CTF winner pictures have my name, like either on their faces or necks or in the background. So I'll be remembered forever. So I like that. So this is, I'm not going to be talking about Stuxnet or any of the really pop cyber war stuff. This is just a bunch of fun stories because I really like reading and I'm really into intelligence and that kind of stuff. And I'm a red team lead currently for Target. So one of the oldest stories is the first spoofed message, and this came in the early 1800s when John Fleming tried to register a patent for secure messaging or secure message sending and receiving. And basically his whole premise was, he's like, you know, if no one else knows what frequency you're using, then it's secure, right? That's a terrible idea. And like he was trying to demonstrate this in front of a crowd, and he was going to be like, I have, you know, so-and-so 300 miles away, and only we know the frequency, so this message will be completely secure. And right before the demo, full of a room full of people, like the telegraph starts going off by itself, and just started typing out a little poem and then little insults like you're an idiot if you think this is secure. And so it was pretty embarrassing. He like threw a cloth over the type or the telegraph machine. It was just like, okay, you know, show's over. You know, we're gonna find this crook and blah blah. It turned out to be a magician who was a couple miles down the road, and who was very simply, he just ran one of his assistants over to the theater, and the guy was just like, okay, every minute I'm gonna change my frequency by this much, and you know, he'll start doing that. And his assistant came back and told him, at this minute, at this exact time, I heard a beep. So he was able to identify the frequency and start sending, you know, spoofed messages. The first case of wire fraud, I think, is during the Civil War, where the South would tap the North's telegraph lines and listen to the orders being sent. The North figured this would happen and started sending false orders. And the South quickly realized this and just started cutting, or they would take the wire and run a generator to it and fry all the telegraph machines on the wire. So it wasn't very nice going back and forth. The first keylogger, has anyone heard of this case? Cool. Also, I think it might have been called Star Wars, but it was from 1976 to 1984. Eastern European government that was friendly tipped us off that a lot of the IBM Selectric, I'm not sure if that's the way to pronounce it, typewriters, what? Awesome. I was not alive in 1982. I'm sorry. So the NSA was kind of tasked with trying to track down this bug, and this bug was incredibly hard to find. So these IBM machines were the targets, and all in all, they found about 16 bugs, 7 in the Moscow embassy and 3 in the consulate in Leningrad, and a total of 16 bugs were recovered from multiple generations, about 5 or 6 generations they spanned, and 12 in the Type 2 series, in the Type 3 series. And they were, at this point in time, nearly undetectable by all in his efforts to figure out that these were there. Wow.
Hello.
Damn hackers. So what made this really cool was that it resisted a lot of conventional detection methods, and even tools at the time that were commonplace wouldn't be able to detect this bug. And it was very, very sophisticated. It was the most sophisticated electronic piece of intelligence at that time. In fact, we didn't even know the Soviets had this kind of manufacturing sophistication until we found this bug. And it was very easy to install on the typewriter, and can be done very quickly by non-technical personnel. So they think that a lot of these typewriters got intercepted when they were being shipped to Moscow or Leningrad, and they were able to get in and get out within a few minutes. And this thing was actually a bar that kind of hovered over like the key hammer strokes and was not in the keys themselves. And sometimes it contained its own power source, so it didn't need to be hooked in, or the other things in the device didn't need to be tampered with. And what made it really hard to detect was that it would do burst transmissions. So only after a certain number of keystrokes would it then send a burst of those 8 4-bit characters a short distance to be picked up and then retransmitted at another frequency. And the frequencies they used were the same frequencies used for Soviet television stations. So it was really hard to see that anything was being transmitted, and furthermore, they could remotely turn off the bug. So if they knew an inspector was coming, every month at the first, then they would just like send a signal to stop broadcasting to this bug, and it wouldn't broadcast the keystrokes anymore. So it was very hard to detect, and the NSA had to go and like use X-ray film to photograph all these machines. And I think, what was it? Kodak. They produced about 800 films of X-ray photographic paper that the NSA was using. And for this operation, the NSA, or 800 sheets per year is all the company produced. And for this operation, the NSA used over 2,000, photographing all the different machines. So it was very sophisticated, very hard to find. So when the NSA was tasked with like remediating this, they went over and tried to talk to the State Department, who runs the embassies, and the State Department hated their guts and would not let them help at all. And the NSA wasn't about to disclose that they were completely compromised. So the NSA just sent their own people over there to try to figure out what they could do. And it made it just worse when the State Department said they had no inventory, no catalog of any hardware or software. And that wasn't an accident. The State Department burned any documentation about anything they used after 2 years. So it was pretty hard for the NSA to like figure out, it's like, oh, you're running that special version of software on this special thing of hardware, and it's not made anymore, and the company is like retired. So the NSA had to re-engineer or reverse engineer some of the equipment they had to replace. And they couldn't even replace all of it, so they just tried to replace the most sensitive things. And all this was an enormous undertaking, and they had to invent completely new ways to ship new replacement stuff over there. And it's very interesting. The NSA declassified this report a number of years ago called the Gunman Project, of how they went and remediated the situation. And this is the old Moscow embassy. Now, the Russians, like back in the day, and sometimes they still are, were real assholes. And whenever they would see like the beginning of the, or not the beginning of the year, whenever the winter in Russia would begin to thaw, that was the time a lot of businesses moved equipment in and out of their offices, because that's the only time the roads were safe enough to move heavy equipment and this and that. And so the Russians would say, oh, look, the Americans are trying to move stuff into the building, and then they would kill the power to the whole building, or just make the elevator non-operable. So the NSA like was moving 21 tons of equipment in and out via stairs over one weekend to try to like accommodate like this whole operation. And like to get stuff into this building, like the halls are only like 21 inches wide, and that's really hard to like have any kind of major equipment to be moved. I'm sorry, 36 inches wide. I was just looking at my notes. And the elevator, if it was working, could only hold 4 passengers at a time. And so they had to move stuff in and out by crane. The Russians had a crane. It didn't work a lot of the time because, like I said, they were assholes. And so the NSA brought its own. Like, they had to get this done. And the NSA historically had an office in the top, the 10th floor. So, of course, the Russians would start a lot of fires on like the 9th floor. Like this happened more than 3 times. And the Russian firefighters would show up and they're just like, we need to get to the 10th floor to put out the fire. And the NSA guys are just like, yeah, no, let it burn. Like, so after all this went down and they remediated a lot of the stuff, it's hard to keep a good secret. And 5 months later, let me look, who broke the story first? Oh, it's not my notes. Sorry. Newsweek, Time, and another MSNBC, I think, broke the news about this. They got a lot of the details wrong, including like who remediated this. I mean, at the time, the NSA wasn't very widely known. In fact, their existence was only revealed like 8 years prior during like a Senate or Congress like deposition meeting, and someone just kind of overheard it when they had to testify about something. So the NSA wasn't really known, and so it was like kind of crazy to be in this embassy at the time. Like you're walking out Friday, and like these men in black show up, and they're just like, "Hey, we're gonna replace everything. Like, don't ask any questions, just go home." And then like you come back to work, and everything, the whole office has changed, and these men in black are just like gone. No one knows who they are or what they did or why. So and that was the story of the NSA at the time. The earliest example of like insider threat behavior analysis I found was also back in the Cold War, when the Russian government every time someone bought a typewriter, they would type up a sample page and have to send it in to the government. And this was because at the time, like there was this kind of Twitter thing going where, you know, since there's so much propaganda going around, if you got a letter from your friend that was like, oh, here's a news article in France or Britain or whatever talking about this, you know, you would type it up by hand on your own typewriter, you know, as many times as you wanted, and then you'd hand it out yourself. It's like modern day retweeting. And so to prevent this, the Russian government would have samples from everyone's typewriter, and as soon as they'd find some piece of information they didn't like, they would look across the records. Oh, this particular typewriter has like this kind of character defect with like the letter T, like it's slightly below where it should be, or the letter I is missing its dot or whatever, and they were able to track a lot of people down with this. It's modern day dot patterns on printers, if anyone's ever heard of that. Oh, wow, that's a lot more than I thought. I told someone about this a while ago, and they're just like, what? That's crazy. So for those of you who don't know, a lot of printers, if you buy them in the US particularly, when you print out anything, it puts a light dot pattern in the upper left or upper right. It's usually like the serial number of that particular printer. So supposedly if you wrote something and printed it up and sent it in as a terroristic threat, the FBI or whomever could potentially trace it back to you. There have been no court cases to date noting that the FBI or any organization has used this as evidence in court for anything. But it's a little suspicious. Anyone ever heard of the Farewell Dossier? Raise your hands. Awesome. So this is a great story. And please feel free to interrupt me and ask me questions and lots of stuff. A much rather interactive audience. So in 1981, the French DST, like their version of the FBI, flipped a very high-ranking KGB agent. And they gave him the code name Farewell, because in case the Russians ever figured it out, they wanted him to think it was an English agent that had flipped him. So they used an English word. But basically, this guy gave over all the best intel, like all the best intel. He gave like tons of, agents. He gave away all their moles. He gave away all their collection targets and their assets around the world, and showed how extensively the KGB had penetrated the West and all their big technology firms, and just crazy amounts of data. And the US government realized it was an economic war with itself. Everything we invented went over there like a few weeks later. So when they found the extent of the damage, instead of just arresting all the moles, they started feeding them their intelligence targets, but slightly modified. And one of the things that the Russians really wanted was gas pipeline control software. They didn't have the math or the software, the capabilities to control the huge amount of resources they were sitting on top of. And they lobbied for a long time to get the software, and we just said no. But when we saw that one of their spies had been sent to collect it, we leaked them a pirated copy of it. And later that year, the software went into testing mode and overloaded one of their gas pipelines and caused a huge explosion. The Russians said it never happened. Like they said, the gas pipeline control systems were all analog, not digital. They said, oh, there was only one minor incident that year and it was repaired within a day. But the US Air Force observed a 3-kiloton blast with no EMP aftershock. So it wasn't a nuke. And in fact, it sent the US to like DEFCON 2, because we were just like, what the hell is this? And like some CIA guys down the hall, we were just like, don't worry about that. Just yeah, they actually thought the operation had failed because it was supposed to go off earlier. No one died, and like they just flattened a huge empty part of Siberia. So, and quote, this was the most monumental non-nuclear explosion ever seen from space. Technically not accurate, but at the time it was. So this was, the Soviets were kind of pissed when they finally figured out what the US was doing, leaking them so much stuff. We caused billions in damage in their economy, like billions. And when everything was starting to come to an end, when they were starting to figure stuff out, we just rolled up the entire Line X operation and arrested, I want to say something like 70 to 80 moles and agents across all the NATO countries. And they weren't just targeting, software. They were targeting like computer chip manufacturing, a lot of factories, chemical processes, aircraft, space stuff. Like the Russians wanted to steal all of our technology. I just wanted to go back because I've just been listening to this audiobook about this gentleman, Vladimir Vietrov, the one who flipped and went and disclosed all this information. He was an interesting guy, and he was stationed in France and in Canada, loved the Western way of life, definitely saw that there was a lot of hypocrisy. And the French DST, when he was posted in France, they tried to flip him, and they failed. And then years later, he just sent them a little postcard that says, hey, I'm ready to start talking. And they had an agent ready for him in no time. And that was cool and all, but he was actually one of the most dangerous moles you could ever possibly imagine, because he'd been doing this for like 40 to 50 years. So he knew exactly what the spy hunters and counter intel was looking for. He was in the analysis division, so he had access to all the KGB's crown jewels, and he knew for an absolute fact that the KGB had not penetrated the French FBI, the French DST. He knew for a fact that they didn't care about the French. The French were like very friendly to the USSR at the time, so he kept a very close eye on the spy hunters in his own organization. He kept a very close eye on a lot of the counter intelligence stuff, and he was passing the crown jewels like on a weekly basis, like did huge amounts of damage. It kind of all came crashing down because he got a little emotional, and his marriage was falling apart, and he was cheating on his wife, and his wife was cheating on him, and he tried to kill his mistress, and weird stuff that happened. He kind of like had a mental break. But he was a very, very warm and well-liked person. So even when he was caught, stabbing his mistress like 20 times, or 19, and she still lived, and then like a police officer or a retired police officer caught them in the act, and he like killed him, and then like tried to drive over her with a car. Like she still lived, and like the KGB like tried to swoop in and then like stop the case, and because they were just like, well, he's our boy. No, if he went crazy and tried to kill her, it's her fault, right? Anyways, I could talk a lot about this guy. He was very interesting, but he did a lot of damage in his time. The first cloud messaging system, Project Westford. Who's heard of this? Awesome. So, in 1963, the U.S. Air Force was really worried about the Soviets knocking out our communication service in the first strike or sabotage. So, they decided to launch like hundreds of thousands of tiny copper shards into space so that they could bounce radio signals off this huge cloud of copper shards. And it worked great. They were 1.8 centimeters long, totaling 20 kilograms. For half the wavelength, so you could bounce stuff off all day, and the neoprene gel that they had sent up just slowly evaporated into space. So the shards shouldn't drift apart that fast, but they did. In fact, after about a month, they drifted apart so bad that they went from 20 kpbs per second to about 0.4. So the US Air Force was about to start launching these things up regularly, and then someone told them, no, that's crazy, stop polluting our space, before that was really a thing. But they've drifted apart now, and we have an artificial ring system around Earth that the US government is responsible for, and all satellites have to stay out of that area, or else they get destroyed. Thank you, US government. The first cyber honey doc, who's heard of this? Cool. So The Cuckoo's Egg was written by Clifford Stoll, and it was, way back when computers were first a thing. And he was an astronomer, and he was at Berkeley, and for a little side job, he got into their IT department, and he realized that there was like a difference between these two catalog systems. Like, if you dial into someone's supercomputer at the time, they would charge you like per second. And he noticed that they had two systems that would charge people like per the second that they would use. And there was like a 75% or a 75-cent error between those two systems. And he eventually tracked it down to this guy named Marcus Hess, who was a German hacker, and he was gathering intelligence on US military targets on behalf of the Soviets. And they paid him in cocaine. Because that's how things went in the 70s. And so for 5 months, Clifford Stoll was tracking this guy down. He left the account vulnerable to, well, he didn't change the password on this compromised account, which the hacker had guessed, but he also didn't patch a vulnerability in GNU Emacs at the time that'll let him get root every time the hacker got in there. And he just watched this guy for 5 months as he hacked into lots of military targets, a lot of defense contractor targets, and he would just call them up after every day and say, hey, you were just hacked. And he got a lot of not kickback, he got a lot of very unhappy people who were just pissed off that he would insinuate such a thing. And then he'd show them the logs, like the exact times and the accounts and stuff like that, and they'd be like, oh, thanks, and then we'll hang up on him. He told the NSA, he told the FBI, he told the CIA for months and months and months. No one really helped him, and he kind of bribed people to eventually trace it back to Germany. And even then, the Germans were really weird about arresting one of their own people for committing a foreign crime that they didn't really care about. And eventually, he was arrested, and then another guy ended up being burned alive in a forest. Or at least that was the official story. I have it on good authority that he is in fact still alive in Russia. Yeah, this is the actual cyber honey doc. So Clifford Stoll had a problem with keeping this hacker online while he made these traces, and he was like, oh, this hacker's all about looking for military networks and stuff like that. So he made up this huge SDI net that implanted all this fake documentation and made the files world readable. And this hacker, of course, got very interested in it, and for hours would peruse them and allowed Clifford Stoll to make multiple traces to confirm that it's this one guy. And I think it's kind of funny that his then fiance or girlfriend, but they did get married, wanted to call the whole thing Strategic Information Network Group, aka Sting, and but they figured that the hacker might catch on, so they renamed it SDI Net. Oh, sorry. One of the documents was if you want more information, please send this letter with the filled out thing to this lady. And they actually used someone's name in the office that Cliff knew, and this spelt her name slightly wrong, and then she received the letter out from an Eastern European diplomat several weeks later. What's up? Yeah? Yeah, the U.S. was modernized enough that we could trace any call within a couple of seconds, but Germany was still a lot of analog and mechanical systems, so they had to call the particular German telephone company, and then the guy would answer, at like, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning in Germany, and then he'd have to like go run down the series of rotors and then like figure out exactly which one has it, and then like test each phone number in their whole like subnet. Yeah, that's why they had to keep them on for so long, because the Germans were a little behind the times. The first sort of graph database poisoning. So has anyone ever heard of a copyright trap? So it was very expensive to make maps at the time, right? Because you have to send out a lot of people to map a lot of places. And so it's really cheap and easy to copy a map though. So map makers would put in little things that were not true or accurate. So this one map company made this town called Allo. It was an acronym from their last names, and whenever it would pop up with another map maker, they would sue the crap out of them. And this is like kind of funny, and like, okay, cool, whatever. But then the town actually popped up. Like someone built a gas station and like store there and called it the Allo general store. And a little kind of town popped up. It's kind of like reality from fiction. And this was in the Catskill Mountain, or Catskills, okay, which is where this actress, Jennifer Connelly, is also from. Just Labyrinth. I thought it was funny. Like, that's not fair. This first mob cyber turf war. So this Barrett Lyon, founder of Prolexic, was later acquired by Akamai's anti-DDoS, was first got into the business by giving advice to whoever would listen to him. And the Russians were getting DDoS because they were running online gambling sites. And these hackers would say, hey, give us money or else we'll take your site offline during the busiest part of the year. And they'd lose lots of money. So it was a big job, and he convinced his employers to fund him and his new startup company. And he started running a lot of their IT infrastructure, including their email, and he started figuring out pretty quickly that these are all mobsters. They actually funded like Poker Stars, like the TV channel, is actually run by Russian mobsters. Well, American mobsters with Russian descent. But he also found out, because he hung out on a lot of underground forums and places, that he was defending them from the Russian mob. The Russian mob had funded a bunch of hackers to just make them money, and they did this quite effectively with DDoS attacks. So he wrapped all his data up and then gave it right over to the FBI, quit, and started a new company called BitGravity, because a lot of his algorithms for anti-DDoS stuff also work for streaming video. The first instance I could find of first prank phone call was in 1884, 8 years after the first phone call, where people would call the local grave digger and would say, hey, so-and-so just died, get all your equipment and stuff, and then go over to this person's house, and it turns out the person would still be alive, which is, I would consider that kind of a threat, but I guess it was funny back then. The first TDOS, malicious busy signal. So the government of Haiti was kind of overthrown for a little bit, and the Clinton administration was just like, okay, why don't we just invade it? And the NSA popped in and was just like, hey, we can disable all their air defense systems because they're all hooked up via POTS, the plain old telephone network. We can make a malicious busy signal that will dial every phone number in the whole country at the same time. And they were just like, yeah, all for it. Because it was kind of the first time the NSA was just like, hey, by the way, we can totally help you out without your war planning. And they ended up not having to do it because they scared the crap out of the people who did the coup d'etat, because Clinton just sent some people like Jimmy Carter, Colin Powell, and some others to just say, hey, you're gonna die. There's no way this is not gonna happen. We are going to invade you and then kill you again. You should leave. And they just left. So, sometimes it helps to carry a big stick. And a similar technique was used by SG-1 in 2005 when trying to keep the Ori out of the, from the Pegasus Galaxy. But this is actually a picture from Haiti. Also with the replicators, they did that too. So the NSA and the CIA kept this little trick around for a while, and they kind of kept it at the time under the information operations division of the CIA and the NSA, which is all kind of weird and messed up, weird history. But they mainly did it to disable foreign defenses. So when the U.S. was bombing Serbia, they saw that they were also hooked up via POTS. But they could do a lot more than just disable the systems. They could actually get in and modify the data that was streaming in. So usually the U.S. kept their aircraft above 15,000 feet, above where their missiles could land a hit on our planes. But when we had to dip below that, we would get into their particular air defense systems, and we would change the angle at which our plane would come from to the system, appearing to the system. Yeah, you understand me. So it would always be a few degrees off. And whenever the missile would misfire or not fire, they would always blame it on technical things. And the only time they landed any missiles on our planes, it was because the operator was sitting at the missile stand, and he would be like, this is off. I can see this a few degrees off. And he would put it into manual mode and then fire the missile by himself, which then would land a hit. So, but we did a lot of other information operations where we would start calling all the generals and the first lady and all the the very higher ups. We'd get into their phone systems, and then we'd call them repeatedly over and over again, day and night, day and night. And anytime they changed their phone number, we just call that day and night. And we record all the responses. So they had lots of responses from the first lady just screaming and cussing at them. And then we'd play it back, be real creepy. And we did some other stuff, anytime they would try to protest via their television networks, their news, oh, the troops are going to be at this place at this time, let's go protest. We would cut all television access to that. And then the one company that we would allow to keep broadcasting, we would force them to play Baywatch, which was at the time the most popular show in the world. So that took care of that problem pretty well. The first internet drug deal was in 1972 when the Stanford and MIT students started emailing each other with their ARPANET accounts from the AI labs. And I think it was on 420, they were just like, hey, you want to send us $5? We'll send you a G. And they just responded yeah, and they actually did. So, yeah, way easier. The most remote hack, and I say this as a runner-up because I can't really confirm it. Voyager 2 is the furthest human man-made object in the universe that we know of, and it started calling back, saying this really weird garbled code one day. And NASA uses the Deep Space Network, the DSN, to control all of our satellites. And there is almost, especially with the old 1970s Voyager series, there's no security. You can actually look up the specs and have a card and send the right signals to just reset it or update its firmware or something like that. So they think that's what some people think actually happened. Some hacker tried to upload their own firmware, which NASA has open sourced very kindly enough, but they didn't have any way to test it. NASA does. They have parts of Voyager and Voyager 2, and they use them to test whenever they're uploading new code, because most of the equipment on there is actually dead or outdated or short-circuited or whatever. It's also possible that a bit could have been flipped due to solar radiation, but these things, that hasn't happened in the last 30 or 40 years, and this is a lot further away from the sun, so it's not as likely to happen. So maybe not. C2 backup, man in the sky. During Desert Storm, Saddam used fiber to issue orders to all of his troops, but the US bombed those when that happened, or when the war first came on, and he switched to microwave transceivers to issue orders, and we had a US spy satellite just sitting right above that thing and listening to all clear text stuff, and we were able to intercept everything. And when they figured this out, because we were like kicking the crap out of them, they started sending messengers on bikes with handwritten notes from Saddam. But by that time, it was too late. So I have a bonus round next, if y'all are up for it. But is there any questions? Does anyone want to hear the bonus round? It's awesome. Well, thank you. It has to do with animals, so I hope you don't like them. I call it the animal kill chain because there's a lot of instances in U.S. intelligence and military history where we've done a lot of weird things, and for good reasons. Like, you know, I'll go over some of these, but I think some of the more famous ones are like the photographer Pigeon. Pigeons are strapped with cameras and sent over battlefields, taking pictures of the city, like Stalingrad or whatever. And a lot of people have probably heard of like the Mammal Marine program. They train dolphins to find and sometimes explode underwater mines. And and I don't know if you follow Cyber Squirrel on Twitter, but it's pretty funny. He's like, oh, way more like outages to our power plant have happened due to squirrels than hackers. And keeps very close tabs on it, which is hilarious. So the first interneted cat, Operation Acoustic Kitty. So the CIA spent about $20 million outfitting cats with microphones, radio receivers, and radios transceivers. They put like the antennas in the tail. They they did a few things, and they tried to deploy one of these cats. I think they called it Rogue One, because because, and I would have loved to have been like working in like the Russian embassy where they tried to do this, because, you know, here's like two guys from the CIA, you know, outside the embassy, and just stopped their car on the side of the street in DC, and which is where I live, by the way. And they're like smoking a cigarette or whatever and looking around, and then they reach into their trunk and like whip out a cat and like throw it. And then, of course, what happened is that the cat had been trained for a very long time, like years, to like go up to like people sitting at a bench, or go up to people sitting at, or go up to windows where it would find food, and just kind of like listen in. But this cat decided to go walk out into the middle of the street, lay down, and then got run over. And I would have loved to be there, like like a secretary at the Russian embassy, like just watching these guys like do a cat toss, and then go run and scoop it up and like throw it in their trunk and like screech away. That just would have been awesome. And I quote, "Our final examination of trained cats," you know, some stuff omitted, "convinced us that the program would not lend itself in a practical sense to our highly specialized needs." Yes, Dr. Eagle might do that. Kamikaze Canines. Has anyone heard of this? Okay, a few. So the Russians were getting desperate. I mean, they were always kind of desperate, but they were training their dogs to blow up German tanks. Maybe a good idea in principle, but the Russians trained them to go after Russian tanks. So they put a Russian tank out in a field and then starve these dogs for a few days, and then strap them with a little backpack and a lever and have them run across the field, dive under the tanks, you know, pull the lever, and then it would go boom. And, you know, maybe a good idea in thought, but in practice, battlefields are very noisy and very scary to dogs and most animals, and they want to stay away from the loud noises, especially if those loud noises are moving right at them. And dogs, additionally, are more sensitive to smell than to sight. So not only would they go after Russian tanks because they looked to be the right tank and it was not, you know, trying to move toward them or kill them, Russian tanks also ran on diesel and German tanks ran on gasoline. So they would much rather, you know, stay on their side of the line and go for the Russian tank that smells about right. All in all, they managed to blow up a few tanks during a few battles, but the Germans caught on pretty quick to what was going on and would shoot the dogs on approach. Even just shooting in front of them would usually scare the dog off. Out of 30 that were deployed, 4 made it to their targets, 6 returned and exploded, and 6 were stopped in transit. The Japanese tried to do this, but they had dog-drawn carts filled with bombs instead of the triggering mechanism being on a little backpack. Stay behind rats. This is a pretty cool story about how just the threat of something is more powerful than the actual thing. So the British Special Operations, as they're from certain areas that they knew the Germans were coming into, they did a whole wanted movie type thing where they stuffed these rats with explosives. They were dead first. The rats were dead. And they would leave them around factory floors, and a lot of these factories had furnaces in them, and a lot of the people in these places would scoop up the rats and toss them into the furnace, and when you're filled with plastic explosive, that tends to end badly. And none of these ever actually got detonated, but the Germans did intercept a shipment of these and quite quickly realized what damage they could do. So they shut down many factories for many weeks trying to clean them all up. And rats are really hard to get rid of, so they did a lot of damage to the German war machine out of fear. So good for them. The chicken timing attack. Has anyone ever heard of blue peacock, blue bunny, or brown bunny? Okay, they're UK code names for all sorts of things. Like they just have, I think they call them the rainbow codes, but they're not actually related to anything. But these particular projects were British's plan to plant tactical nukes in German mines and other places. So if the Russians invaded, these would be used as denial of area weapons. So they didn't want to like destroy like Russian tanks or people or whatever. They just wanted to stop them from being able to move their troops very quickly through an area, which is like the Brussels, like their whole defense plan is to like blow up their highways and wait for the US. Like that's their defense in case Russia or Germany decides to invade again. Like, so the thing is, Germany gets really cold, and the electronics of the day were very sensitive to damage from the temperature. So they were just like, how do we keep these things heated through the cold German winter? And one idea that was proposed was we put chickens in the bomb. With enough food and water, they will keep the electronics warm all winter. And I have some footage of when they were looking at this. So they never actually did this because they figured that if the Germans found out that they were planting bombs, you know, in their country just to blow them up later, they thought maybe the Germans would be so pissed that they would take those bombs and use them against the British. So they decided not to. During the Spanish Civil War, they had a lot of the nationalists versus the kind of socialists. They had a hard time like keeping supply lines open to each other. So the pilots would strap sensitive equipment like radios to turkeys and toss them out the window as they flew over these areas. Not only would it soften, blow and act as a natural cushion, but it also fed their people. The flying Nazi pigeon hunters, completely what you think it is. The British Special Intelligence Service discovered that Germans were sending messages via pigeon, which is not an uncommon thing back in the day. So the British, sorry, I'm digging into your time. It's Josh, everybody, the next guy. So the British created the Army Pigeon Service Special Section. And they basically trained peregrine falcons to hunt these very special pigeons and eat them. Which was kind of like the hard thing because they wanted the pigeons to be brought back with their messages intact so they could figure out what the Germans were sending, but the falcons really did not like sharing their food. So I don't know. Oh yeah, yeah. There is an RFC released for April Fools, but it's actually implementable for IP over avian. The last slide, bombardiers. Has anyone ever heard of this? Cool. So when we were looking at bombing Japan, which we did a lot in World War II. The US decided to build this fake town, very Japanese style, and they filled this giant bomb casing with hibernating bats, because apparently when you freeze bats, they just go to sleep. And they strapped them with explosives, and they were just like, oh, we'll drop this bomb in New Mexico where it's really hot, and this bomb casing will open, and these bats will just wake up on their free fall down, want to roost somewhere, and they would go for this little town. And that was cool and all, except over half the bats didn't wake up. They just hit the ground and exploded. And the timers on a lot of the bombs were not so great, so they would not blow up all exactly 1 hour later, but blow up in series and waves. And the bats traveled a lot further than they thought they would and started setting fires to local U.S. towns. All in all, this project was considered a success because they figured if they could drop it during the right weather conditions, they could set a whole town on fire that they couldn't possibly put out and maybe cause secondary explosions if they launched them near a factory or something. But the project was shelved when the guys who were developing this found out that they were also developing the atom bomb. And then they dropped that, and they're just like, well, the bats don't look as cool as that. So that's it for me. I read a few books for this because, like I said, I like reading, I like intelligence, and I like history. So I can give you reviews on any of these, but that's it for me.